So if you look at the picture right there, well, first of all, let me ask you this. Do you know what size of a jar this is right here? What do you, how much, like quantity? How much is this? Got any guess? What is it? What do you think? No. A what? What is this? Actually, it's pint. It's a pint. Do you know how many pints of blood there are in the body? Because this makes all the difference in the world when we're talking about bleeding. Because obviously, the more blood you lose, the more damaging it is to the body. So this is a pint. 1 pint. How many pints of blood do you have in your whole entire body? Or I should say, should you have if you're healthy? Any idea? Ooh. 10. Give them about 10 pints of blood. I will tell you that in medical terminology, when you are measuring things like fluids, blood fluids, lymph, fluids as in the bags that they give you, they're either in liters, but when we're talking about blood, we're talking about pints. So if somebody were in a car accident and they lost a ton of blood, not a ton, but they lost a lot of blood and they needed a blood transfusion, then they would get a pint. When you give blood, when the bloodmobile comes and you give blood, you give a pint. Because a pint is about all that you can give under normal, healthy circumstances without it causing some kind of effect. And even for some people it does, because I don't know how many of you have given blood, but it can certainly, even that 1 pint can have an effect. You generally have about 10 pints of blood if you are healthy and normal, okay? This is obviously not blood. I just wanted it to be a visual for you to see how much a pint actually is, okay? So you have 10 of these, okay? So what we need to look at is how much blood can you lose, and as you lose certain amounts of blood, what's going to be the effect on the body? Because when you know that, then you know how much of an emergency the loss of blood is going to be and how fast and knowledgeable that you're going to need to be to give first aid to somebody if they're bleeding, okay? So we can start right here with the effects of blood loss. We are doing controlling bleeding. And actually, blood loss is in classes. So the first class of blood loss means that you lose about 15% of the 10 pints that you have in your body, give or take. And that is just one of these, 1.5 of these pints. So that's a class 1. And it looks like this, and this is where your red color crayon or whatever you've got is going to come into play, because as you write this down, I want you to draw a body, not a stick figure, but draw a body. I don't care if it's a gingerbread looking kind of figure. Draw a human figure like that. At the head, you're going to draw a line, and you're going to color the head part where the arrow is, color that part red. Because that's about how much blood is in the head, 1.5 pints. So, now I'm not saying that that's where your blood is going to be lost from. I just want you to have an understanding that that's how much of the body's blood would be lost with 1.5 pints. So draw yourself a little body. I will say the bigger that you draw it, the easier that it is, but that's strictly up to you. And then from the head up, from the neck up, color it red. Bless you. There's no too big or too little. It's what you can understand yourself. So, 15% blood loss, 1.5 liters. So, what kind of effect if you lose this much blood? What is the effect going to be on the body? if somebody gets cut a little bit and they lose that much, or if you give a pint, and although that's all when you go to the blood bank or to the Bloodmobile or whatever, you're only going to give a pint. But if you gave a pint and then half of another pint, what do you think the effects on the body will be? What do you think? Dizziness, maybe. What else? And let me ask you this question. Does it affect everybody, that kind of blood loss, a pint and a half, is it going to affect everybody the same way? No. How many of you have given blood? Okay, a few of you have given blood. Did you have any effect? None? Did you have any effect? Did you, Cheyenne? No effects? Okay, because I have had students who would go and give it like a period or two before they came to me, and they are pale, and they can't hold their head up, and they feel sick to their stomach. So it does not affect everybody the same way. What do you think some of the things might be that determine how you feel after you give a pint of blood? What do you think, Joseph?
How much blood you have in your body.
Some of that is how much blood you have in your body. What else? How much you've eaten, or not so much eaten, yes, but more how much fluid that you have taken in. They generally recommend, and see, they don't tell you this, and before we have our blood drives here at school, I wish they would. You really need to drink about 3 bottles of water before you go and give blood, because your blood, it basically consists of fluid, and it does 2 things. One is it pumps up your blood vessels so that when they go to poke you with a needle, they can find the vessel really easily, because that's what pumps it up. Sometimes if they have to poke you a couple of times and they say your vessels are too small, it's simply because you're dehydrated. And I don't know if they tell you that or not, but that's the truth. So you need to drink 2 or 3 bottles of water before you go give blood. It will also help you from becoming dizzy or feeling sick or whatever. And yes, you should eat before. I know they give you crackers and things afterwards. And do they give you water? I know they give you crackers. Do they give you anything to drink? Or do they just tell you to go get some? Do they give you? Okay. And they should. But really and truly, you would fare better if you would do it ahead of time. So just if you know, and I do think that it's generally toward the end of this month or in November, pretty soon, when the Bloodmobile, I think it comes like 2 or 3 times a year. And so if you're going to do that, just remember, and I'll remind you actually when I know that it's coming, that you need to drink something, okay? So that is part of it, okay? So what happens is, first of all, it's going to be well tolerated. Just losing a pint to a pint and a half of blood, regardless of if you lose it from an injury or if you lose it from donating blood, it's not, for most people, it's going to be okay. You're not going to have any ill effects from it, okay? Because what's going to happen is your blood vessels are going to constrict. What does constrict mean? Get smaller. And dilate, if I were to say they dilated, what would they do? Right, just the opposite, get bigger. But your blood vessels tend to constrict with blood loss to slow the blood loss. So that's the body's natural defense, and we'll talk about that some more as well. You're not going, well, generally speaking, and again, a lot of it has to do with a person's general health. For the most part, you're going to remain alert. Most people don't have any problem concentrating, whatever. It's not, most of the time it's not a problem. But it just depends on each individual as well. Your blood pressure and your pulse should pretty much stay close to normal. By just that much blood, you shouldn't have a circulation problem. You shouldn't have a pulse or blood pressure problem unless you already do. If you already do, then it could, exacerbate the problem and make it that much worse. But for the most part, just a class 1 bleed is not that big of a deal for most people. Okay? All right, let's look at what happens if you lose, or if you have a class 2 bleed. Okay, class 2, that means you lose 15 to 30% of your blood, and it is 4.5 of these. So we go from not much to like 4 times as much with a class 2. That's quite a bit of blood. Okay, so draw your body diagram again. And then at the bottom of the rib cage and with the arms straight down, it has to go across the arms as well. Not just the torso, but draw the arms on your little body straight down like that one is. And then you got to go straight across and then color everything red above that line. Now, it's not at the waist, guys. It's like right below the rib cage. Right under the breast. It's where that goes. So if you were to lose 4.5 pints of blood, or somewhere between 15 and 30%, that's how much blood is in the top part of your body. That is not saying that that's the only place you would lose the blood. It's just a diagram for you to see how much blood there is in parts of the body. Now, I will say this. For you to lose 4.5 pints, 30% of the blood in your body, you're going to have a pretty bad cut. Probably at this point, either lots of shallow cuts or either cut an artery for you to lose that much blood at a time. Okay? Obviously, with that much blood, because let's think about it. How many pints did I say was in the whole body? Okay, so half of 10 would be what? 5. So now we're at 4.5. This is serious math here. We're almost to half of the blood in the body. Half of the blood. And we're just at a class 2 bleed. Okay, so obviously it's going to be a more serious issue. Okay, your blood vessels maintain flow to vital organs. Let me just say this. When you start to lose this much blood, the body automatically works really hard to save itself. And all of the blood is going to be pumped harder to the vital organs for the body to save itself. It doesn't mean that it can save itself, but it certainly does attempt to save itself. So it's going to start pumping hard the rest of the blood to those vital organs and not so much to the extremities, because there's no vital organs in the extremities. But if your organs don't get enough blood and start to shut down, it could be, curtains for you. Your brain and your heart, mainly. And like I said, to the other organs, to the other parts of the body, like the extremities, which I hope that you got on your test yesterday, the extremities. There were actually 3 answers on that body yesterday that were extremities. If you were absent yesterday, you need to see me about making that up. What else is going to happen is your skin is going to get cool and dry and pale or ashen. What color is ashen? Gray. Gray. And that is kind of what happens when you start to see somebody who is about almost dead. They kind of look gray. Pale is just where the blood drains. And we've seen, you can be pale. People are pale sometimes after they give 1 pint of blood because the blood just kind of drains, But ashen is a completely different color. And you recognize that something is seriously wrong with somebody if they look ashen, okay? But their skin is cool and dry, not sweaty. You would think that they might be sweaty, but they're not. Your heart rate is going to increase. Why? Why is your heart rate going to increase instead of slow down? If you have less blood? Trying to distribute that blood flow to the vital organs. It's got to pump extra hard, which is a good thing and a bad thing. How is that? Obviously a good thing because it's trying to get it to the vital organs, but how could that heart rate be a bad thing? Joseph, what do you think?
Your heart's pumping way too fast and too hard.
But why would that be a bad thing in regard to the bleeding? Yes, it's trying to get it to the vital organs, but what? What about the bleeding? It's also, depending on where you're bleeding, that may make it bleed faster. So that's why you as first aid or paramedic or whoever needs to stop that bleeding, because they know the heart is beating faster. The faster the heart beats, the faster the blood flow, the more blood that's going to be lost. So that's where you have to be careful. Your breathing is going to increase as well, because when one does, the other does. Heart rate increases, breathing increases. Why? Needs more oxygen. Bottom line, those two things generally cannot be separated. So when you've got, almost half of your blood is gone, then yes, your breathing and your heart rate is going to increase. And you are going to feel restless and confused. This happens a lot with car accidents. Now, when I say restless, what happens is, even regardless, restless means that while you're trying to get somebody to lie down, let's say they've cut an artery. So what I told you, about putting your thumb pressure like on the brachial artery right here and raising the arm, you're going to probably want that person to be lying down. Okay, remember we talked about that? Well, they're not going to want to lay down. If they can, they're going to want to get up and walk around and see what's going on and find somebody. They may talk out of their head, because that's what blood loss does. And so for you to get them to lie down and stay lying down and stay still, because the other thing too is the more they move, the faster their heart beats, then the faster that the blood flows, then the more blood that's going to be lost. So you want to try to contain them and try to get them to lie down and be as still as possible to keep the heart rate down so that there's less blood loss. Unfortunately, that does not always work. All right, class number 3. Now you have lost 6 of these. That's over half the blood in your body. 6 pints. Over half. That's a 30 to 40% blood loss. So now draw your body and draw your line at the waist. Yes.
Wait, if it's you've lost more than half, how would it be 30 to 40%? Doesn't make sense.
I agree, it doesn't, but that's exactly what it says. You're right. Bottom, 60% of 10 would be, yes, it would. But that's not what the book says. I'm just going straight by the book. All of the arms. The waist, from the waist up, and all of the arms. So you know that at this point there's going to be some serious issues with the effects on the body when you lose over half of the blood in your body. The body just doesn't tolerate that well. So the blood pressure is going to fall. Which indicates that your heart rate is changing. And this is where you begin to go into shock. Tell me what shock is. And I'm not talking about shock like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that just happened. That's not the kind of shock I'm talking about. I know you know, Josh. Somebody else needs to answer. What is it, Maria?
When your body's not getting enough oxygen.
Your body's not getting enough oxygen. The major organs are not getting enough oxygen, and they're starting to shut down. Listen to me. People die from shock. They die from shock. And it's not just from a bleeding incident. Any time that there is trauma to the body and the organs start to shut down, and that does not have to be the result of blood loss. It can be internal injury. It can be brain damage. It can be broken bones. Anytime the body undergoes trauma, the body can start going into shock. And as a result, when those organs start to shut down, somebody is about to die. And we're going to do a whole unit on shock because there's several different kinds of shock that we need to talk about. But the bottom line is, you at this point actually, in my opinion, in a class 2, when that person begins to get restless and they're confused, you need to treat them for shock. Treating somebody for shock is simple. Anybody know what to do? Nobody? It's simple. Lie them down and prop their feet up on something about 12 inches. They need to be flat on their back with their feet propped up on something about 12 inches and cover them up with towels, blankets, jackets, whatever you've got. Even though they may say, I'm hot, don't put that on me, you cover them up. So really and truly, and here's the thing, you can't hurt them by doing that, even if they're not going into shock. It would be better to treat somebody for shock than not treat them if you're not sure. Because if you just prop somebody's feet up and put something over them, you're not going to hurt them, no matter what. But if they do go and have shock, and you don't know that, and you do it, you may have saved their life. So most of the time, and this is another thing though, is because they're restless and they want to get up, they don't realize what's happening, you have to convince them to stay lying down. A book bag is enough. Couple of rolled up towels is enough. 12 inches. It doesn't need to be high. But basically, for you, that's all you can do. But it's better to do it, even if you're not sure. Well, you say, well, how am I supposed to know they're in shock? Well, when we do, we'll see the symptoms. But the bottom line is just do it. Just do it. Cover them up with something and prop their feet up. That's all you need to do. It's not hard. Okay? Because that may save their life. Why what? Because when you prop their feet up, the blood goes back to the brain. Because to keep the body warm, because when the organs start to shut down, on the inside, the organs start to get cold. They may be sweating. And they may say, don't put that on me, I'm hot, I'm hot, I'm hot. But you need to do it anyway. You need to explain to them, no, you really do, I really do need to cover you up.
Would you put your arms up there?
Nope. 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 You lie them down and prop their feet up and cover them up. That's it. That's it. That's all you can do. Paramedics can do more, but they would greatly appreciate it if you were the first person there. Now, by the way, having a heart attack, having a stroke, those don't cause people to go into shock. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who falls, like somebody fell off a roof or out of a tree, or a car accident, or something like that. That's what you do. I will say this, if you suspect because of a fall that they may have a spinal or a back injury, don't prop their feet up. Anytime, you just don't move them if you suspect. And by the way, I don't know if you know this or not, Miss Shirley, the nurse, Miss Shirley, in the clinic, you know Miss Shirley in the clinic, you've been to the clinic, right? She was in a really bad car accident last week and fractured one of the vertebrae in her back and had to have surgery. So, again, she did say, because I did talk to her, and she said that she knew immediately that her back, it was in the thoracic. You got your spine is in 3 sections: the cervical, the thoracic, and the lumbar. It was in the middle, right in the middle. She doesn't know if it was from the airbag, because both airbags on the side and the front hit her. And she doesn't know if that's what did it or if it was the actual impact itself. But she said, I knew as soon as it cracked. And she said, I was screaming, my back. Couldn't get the door open, had to take her out through the window of the car. It was a pretty bad accident. She's probably lucky to be alive. So something like that. You let paramedics do that, If somebody's screaming, my back, don't try to get them out of the car. Let the paramedics do it. You don't need to do that. So, these people also, they've lost 6 pints of blood. They're going to be confused and anxious. Again, they may try to get up and walk around. You don't want them to do that. First of all, you can't manage bleeding if they're walking around. These people need treatment right now. And that generally means that you've got to do something. Remember, that bleeding is one of the 3 life-threatening injuries that you do with an initial assessment. If you know they're responsive because they're screaming, you don't even need to do checking bleeding and all that stuff. Checking breathing. You need to address the bleeding and get it stopped, especially if you know that it's bad. Or the vital organs are going to fail, and that person is going to die or have permanent damage, which could be avoided for that person if you do this correctly. You got all this, Anthony? Got it? All right, class 4. More than 40% blood loss. Actually, it's more than that, obviously. Because at this point, the last one, I'll just change that because that doesn't even make sense. So we're talking more than 60% blood loss, actually. So this is from the top of the legs. This is how much blood would be lost at 60% from the top of the legs up. From your thighs up. So that's what you're going to color. So the only blood that you would have left, just visually speaking, would be the amount of blood that's in your legs, which is not enough really to sustain life. At this point, you probably aren't even going to have any blood pressure. If they were to take your blood pressure with a blood, you know how they take it with a blood pressure cuff? They're not even going to find it. They're not going to find any blood pressure because there's not enough blood to produce pressure. You got to have enough to produce some pressure. Your vital organs are beginning to fail. That's your lungs, your heart, your kidney, your brain, your liver, all those vital organs that keep you alive. And by the way, kidneys is one of those. We often think about your brain, your heart, your lungs, but I don't know if you realize this or not, but when people's kidneys, even if the heart doesn't start to fail and the brain doesn't start to fail, if your kidneys fail, you're going to die. That's just how important they are. You're going to be lethargic. What's the lethargic mean? You all know because you are every single day that you walk in here. What's lethargic? Anybody? What is it? Yeah, feeling lazy, like you just can't hold your head up. That's not anybody here today, is it? No, Shine, you pumped up on something over there. Yeah, lethargic. Stuporous. That's not stupid. That's a whole different ballgame there. What's stuporous mean? If somebody's in a stupor, what are they? You actually generally hear that term used when somebody's drunk. They're in a stupor. What does stupor mean? Mentally. Yes. They may be conscious and responsive, but they're not going to be competent in any way, shape, or form. They're probably not going to be able to tell you that you can help them if you were to ask them that question. So pretty much if somebody's in a stupor, you've got implied consent because they're not competent enough to tell you that it's okay for you to help them. Eventually, they're going to become unresponsive. If you don't stop the bleeding, actually, you don't not just have to stop the bleeding. They're going to need blood. So you've got to get them to the hospital ASAP. You need to already, at this point, when you see there's that much blood, you need to already have 911, obviously, coming. And death, they're going to die at this point if you don't get them some help. And even depending on what other injuries they may have, even that may not be enough to save them. But just from the standpoint of a bleeding injury, this is serious. This is serious. So that gives you some idea about blood loss and the effect that it has on the body. So that you understand that when you see somebody bleeding, depending on how they're bleeding, how much blood is lost, you know that at least you have an idea of what's going to happen to that person and how serious it is that you need to get it stopped. Because if let's say you stop at a car accident and they're bleeding a little bit, but not badly, remember that you don't stop and address a class 1 bleed if there are other things. Somebody else may be unconscious. Somebody else may be in the middle of the road that you need to get them out. Somebody else may be, I don't know, have a worse bleed. You have to pick and choose what's the most important. A class 1, they'll live. A class 2, they'll live. You can tell them just to hold on to, put pressure on your own arm. They can do that. So at least you know how important that it is for them or for you to get help and to stop the bleeding. Okay? So there are 3 ways that the body by itself is going to try to stop the bleeding. Let's suppose no one stops. No one's there to help them and they're bleeding. People do bleed to death, obviously. But the body is automatically wired and created in such a way that it will help itself to a degree. Okay? And there are 3 things that you probably already know when a vessel, and that could be arteries, capillaries, or veins. Those are your 3. And we already talked about what those 3 do. So there are 3 ways that the body can fix itself if it's not too bad. Let me just say that, if it's not too bad. Okay? First is a vascular spasm. Anytime you hear the word vascular, what does that refer to? Blood vessels. And a spasm, what happens when somebody has a spasm? What does a spasm do? What is a spasm? Come on now. Generally, anytime something spasms, yes, it constricts or it shrinks. Well, that's what a vascular spasm is. That damaged vessel will automatically start to constrict to slow the bleeding and allow for clotting to take place. Now, clotting is a different story. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the vessel itself will start to constrict to slow the flow of blood. And you don't have to do anything to that. It's automatic. That's why people eventually stop bleeding. They've been cut or whatever, and no one's there to help them, or maybe they're unconscious. They got knocked unconscious, so they didn't stop. They didn't put pressure on it. Nobody was there, and it's all dried. That's because the body will stop it itself eventually. That's one way, is vascular spasm. Okay? Second way is inside your blood, you have blood cells. You got white blood cells, red blood cells. You got all kinds of stuff in your blood. But you have platelets. I know you've heard of that, right? Yeah. You've heard of platelets. You got platelets which stick together and stick to the walls of the injured vessel and form a plug. What is it called? Happens only in males. It is a hereditary disease where there is no clotting formula in the blood. What's it called? Only in males. Hereditary disease where their blood does not clot. Sorry? I didn't hear you. It is a hereditary disease passed from mother to sons. Only boys have this disease, although it's passed from the mother because she's the one that has the recessive gene, and their blood does not clot. Nobody in here knows that. You've never heard of hemophilia? Oh, hemophilia? People, boys, guys who are hemophiliac. This actually was a big deal back in the 80s. This is how a lot of AIDS or HIV got spread before we knew what it was with boys who were hemophiliac, and they would have to go, they get cut, and there's no clotting agent, so they just bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed and bleed, no matter how minor the cut is. And they would have to go to the hospital and get a blood transfusion. Well, this was before we knew anything about HIV, and it was before we tested blood, because we didn't even know that there was anything that could be in blood that could infect another person. So people gave blood, and then if somebody needed blood, you just gave it to that person without checking it, because we didn't know, nobody knew. And that, sometimes the blood that was given by people was infected with HIV, and nobody knew it, and they gave it to generally boys. And that's another reason that people thought that all those boys were homosexual, and they blamed the spread of AIDS on guys being homosexual, when it had absolutely nothing to do with that whatsoever. It was because they got blood transfusions that were tainted with HIV virus. No one knew that at the time, but that's where that whole, this is a gay disease among men, that's where that started. And it was not true at all. It was just these kids who were hemophiliac had to have a blood transfusion. We didn't test blood, and we didn't know. So that happened up until, HIV was the 80s, early 80s. So that happened way up until then. It's only been like 20 years that we figured this out. But platelets are in the blood. And, by the way, you know how when you give blood, did you know that you can give just platelets? You can donate just platelets. You know what they do? Actually, it's a little bit more of a... They take your blood, like they take a pint of blood. Platelets are heavy. And what they'll do is they'll take your pint of blood and they'll put it in you know what a centrifuge is, right? Spin it. And because the platelets are heavy, they'll sink to the bottom. And what's left, they'll be real red at the bottom. So it'd be like if I put this in there, and then this is red at the bottom, and this is pretty much clear. That's just your plasma, water. And then what they'll do is they'll pull the plasma off and just leave the platelets at the bottom, and they actually give you the plasma back via your IV, and they save the platelets. Tell me, why in the world would we want to save platelets? Just told you. Right, for hemophiliacs, because sometimes they get blood transfusions, they need the platelets. Their body doesn't produce any platelets, so they get transfusions of platelets every now and then to help maintain some protection should they get cut. So you can give just platelets as well. And it's the same process. It's just that you have to stay longer, because they centrifuge your blood and then they give you the plasma back through an IV. And then they just keep the platelets that are at the bottom, and they send those to the blood bank and keep those. Question? All right, and then clotting. And notice that's coagulation. I know that you had to have had that word at some point in some science class. If something coagulates, it clots, basically. It is a fibrin. It looks like this. It is produced in the blood, and it clumps along with the platelets to form a web that seals the leak of the blood. So it's like a web. The platelets are what you see right here, this red. And then this is that fibrin. Looks like a spider web. And together, that's what makes a scab. When you bleed, and then it stops bleeding and it forms a scab, that's the fibrin and the platelets together that do that. And that's the body's natural way of stopping the bleeding process. The body is an incredibly created, functioning machine that will do everything in its power by itself to survive. Everything to survive. If you do nothing, the body, it can only go so far, but it will work for a while without any help from you in all areas, which is pretty cool. Questions? All right, so on Monday, we will talk about what we do in first aid when the body's own defense is not enough. There's other things that need to be done.